The sharp click of polished shoes echoed down the narrow aisle, slicing through the stillness of the first-class cabin. Flight attendant Diana Kessler, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and even sharper instincts, moved with the kind of authority that didn't welcome questions. Her lips were pressed into a tight, practiced line as she stopped at seat 3A, towering over the woman seated there. "I need to see your boarding pass," Diana said, her tone clipped and unyielding. The woman looked up slowly, seemingly unbothered by the sudden demand. She didn't flinch or look confused. Instead, she blinked once, calmly, like someone disturbed mid-thought. What no one, not Diana, not the passengers around her, not even the co-pilot in the cockpit, knew was that the woman in 3A wasn't just another well-dressed traveler. Avery Caldwell owned Orion Skies Airlines, and within the next few hours, Diana Kessler's entire life would begin to unravel, 30,000 feet above ground. Before we go any further, drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you're watching this story from. And if you love emotionally charged tales with a twist, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what happens next. The cabin hummed with quiet anticipation, the kind of hush that settles right before takeoff. Passengers tapped through last-minute emails, adjusted seat settings, and sipped on pre-flight refreshments served in real crystal. Tucked by the window, Avery sat alone, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of late-afternoon light. She exuded grace without effort, her posture relaxed, her demeanor cool, but her mind, always alert. Avery didn't travel with an entourage. She didn't flaunt her status either. Her wealth was the kind that moved behind the scenes, subtle, generational, and powerful enough to ripple through entire industries without anyone noticing. Dressed in a sleek charcoal turtleneck and tailored slacks, she looked like someone important but unidentifiable. The only hint of her true stature was the fine gold bracelet on her wrist. Custom-made, unique. But even that could be missed if you weren't paying close attention. The murmurs of light conversation filled the cabin as Diana Kessler made her way back down the aisle. She paused at various seats, checking that all was in order. Glancing at seat belts, overhead bins, drink requests, her reputation preceded her, strict, efficient, and unafraid to enforce rules when she believed them to be violated. She wasn't just confident, she owned her role in the air. As she neared 3A, something about Avery caught her eye. The calmness, the minimal luggage, or maybe it was just a gut feeling, a suspicion she couldn't shake. Diana's eyes drifted to the slim leather tote tucked neatly under Avery's seat, her head tilted slightly, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, miss," she said, voice tight. "May I see your boarding pass?" Avery didn't react right away. She glanced briefly to her left where a man across the aisle, a silver-haired gentleman in a designer blazer, was leisurely sipping champagne, unbothered. No one had asked for his ticket. Still silent, Avery reached into her bag, pulled out the pass, and handed it over without a word. Diana's eyes darted over the details. Seat 3A, first class. Fully confirmed. Everything checked out. But still, she hesitated. "Are you certain this is your assigned seat?" she asked, voice flat but probing. Avery inhaled softly. "That's what the ticket says." Diana didn't move right away. She glanced over her shoulder, perhaps expecting backup. One of her junior crew members, Leah Monroe, passed by but didn't intervene. She simply arched an eyebrow and continued toward the galley. Around them, the air began to shift. Subtle awareness. Passengers weren't just watching. They were listening. 2 rows back, Grayson Blake, a middle-aged man with a cool, analytical demeanor, adjusted in his seat, pretending to read but fully tuned in. Diana let out a tight laugh, polite on the surface, sharp underneath. "Sometimes mistakes happen with seating assignments," she said. "We just want to make sure everyone's in the right place. A mistake, not a system error, not a simple check. A mistake." The word stung more than she knew. Avery had heard this tone before. The mass suspicion, the quiet challenge to her right to be in spaces others stepped into unquestioned. She extended her hand. "If there's an issue, I'd like my ticket back." Diana hesitated again, her fingers clenched slightly around the pass before she finally returned it. "Enjoy your flight," she said, and walked away. Avery slid the ticket back into her bag. But something had shifted. The once serene cabin now buzzed with a quiet tension. People had noticed, but as usual, no one said a word. Turning back to the window, she watched the last of the luggage being loaded. It was going to be a long flight. What Avery didn't yet know was that Diana Kessler wasn't finished with her, and when she returned, it would be with a decision that would change everything. Avery slowly removed one earbud, tilting her head toward the woman still standing before her. Her voice remained quiet, composed. "If you have something to say," she said calmly, "you can say it here." Diana's nostrils flared. Her authority was being challenged, and she didn't like that. "This isn't up for discussion," she snapped, folding her arms. "I'm asking you to step out of your seat." Avery stayed still. Her fingers tapped the armrest in a slow, steady rhythm. "And if I refuse?" Diana's jaw flexed. "Then I'll notify security when we land." That was the moment everything shifted. A low murmur swept through the first-class cabin. Soft, uneasy whispers passed between curious passengers. What had started as a quiet exchange was now morphing into something else, something bigger. Near the galley, Leah Monroe, the younger flight attendant, glanced over from where she had been prepping the beverage cart. She froze mid-step, eyes narrowing as she took in the tension. Without hesitation, she put down the tray and strode toward the growing scene. "Is there a problem here?" Leah asked, her voice neutral but firm, scanning between Avery and Diana. Before Avery could respond, Diana spoke first. "She's refusing to cooperate." Leah's brow furrowed. "With what exactly?" Diana hesitated, just for a second, long enough to register surprise that she was being questioned. Avery leaned back in her seat, not taking her eyes off Diana. "She hasn't explained why she's asking me to move, and I think everyone here deserves to know." Now, even passengers who had tried not to seem nosy were fully engaged. The cabin practically crackled with tension. Grayson Blake, the man across the aisle, lowered his glass and studied the unfolding situation, like a man watching a high-stakes poker game. Diana squared her shoulders. "I don't believe she's supposed to be in this seat." Silence fell like a blanket. A few heads turned. Avery exhaled softly through her nose. "I showed you my boarding pass," she said evenly. Diana's voice was steady but defensive. "I need to verify it again." From several rows back, a woman let out a sharp scoff. Jenna Holloway, mid-30s, glasses slipping down her nose, crossed her arms. "You've got to be kidding me." Leah looked between the two women. Her voice had dropped to a quieter, more serious tone. "Diana," she said carefully, "you already checked her pass." Diana didn't respond immediately. Her lips tightened. Leah sighed, massaging her temple. "If there was a problem, it should have been handled before we left the ground. This feels like harassment." Diana's face flushed, but she still refused to back down. "I'm following protocol." Avery moved then, unhurried. She reached into her bag and slowly retrieved her boarding pass again, holding it up for everyone to see. "Here," she said simply. "Go ahead. Verify it." There was a pause, just long enough to expose Diana's uncertainty, before Leah stepped forward and gently took the ticket from Avery's hand, before Diana could. She skimmed it. Then her shoulders relaxed, and she turned to face Diana. "She's exactly where she's supposed to be." A hush swept over the cabin, followed by a swell of murmurs. Grayson leaned back with his drink, raising an eyebrow like he'd just watched someone lose a bet. Diana's throat bobbed. Her fingers twitched at her side, but instead of stepping away, instead of accepting the correction, she made one final, unforgivable mistake. She reached out and grabbed Avery's arm. It wasn't violent. It wasn't rough. But it was visible and intentional. A gasp rippled through the cabin. One passenger stood in surprise. Another audibly whispered, "Did she just touch her?" Avery didn't flinch. She didn't need to. Leah's face went pale. "Diana," she breathed, stunned. Diana pulled her hand back instantly, her eyes wide, as if realizing too late what she had done. But the damage was already done. Avery's expression didn't change much. Her lips lifted, just slightly, not in amusement, and certainly not in anger. It was something more dangerous. She reached for her phone. Her movements were too calm, almost surgical in their intent. She pressed a single button and raised the phone to her ear. When she spoke, it wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was controlled. "Gate control," she said clearly. "This is Avery Caldwell, owner of Orion Skies. We have a situation on Flight 921. Diana's world tilted. Every head in the cabin turned toward Avery. Silence swept over the rows like a wave. No one could pretend not to hear that name. Owner of Orion Skies. Diana stopped breathing. No, this couldn't be real. The woman she had just manhandled, the one she'd humiliated in front of half the cabin, she wasn't just a first-class passenger. She was the passenger. Avery remained composed as she continued her call. "There's been an incident involving one of the flight crew. I'll be filing a full report when we land." Diana opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her heart thundered in her ears. Leah was the first to recover. She took a small step forward. "Ms. Caldwell," she said softly, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. I had no idea." Avery raised a hand without looking at her. She wasn't accepting apologies. Not yet. The atmosphere had changed. Where once there was curiosity, now there was shock. Some passengers were whispering. Others just stared wide-eyed. Grayson chuckled to himself. "Well," he muttered into his drink, "this just turned into a show." Finally, Diana found her voice again, though it cracked under pressure. "Miss Caldwell," she stammered, "if I had known—" Avery cut her off, voice still calm, but sharp as a scalpel. "You would have treated me differently." Diana nodded slowly, her face drained of color. She had spent nearly 2 decades in this industry. She dealt with chaos, complaints, and customer meltdowns, but she had never mishandled something this catastrophically. Avery lowered her phone. She didn't need to speak loudly. The silence in the cabin would carry every word for her. She didn't yell. She didn't grandstand. She didn't need to. Everyone was already watching. The voice on the other end of Avery's phone finally spoke, calm, professional, and listening intently. No one else on the plane could hear it, but from the steel in Avery's eyes, it was clear the conversation was serious. "Yes," Avery said coolly. "I'll remain in my seat. But upon landing, I expect an immediate debrief with the flight supervisor and corporate HR. And I want her," she gestured toward Diana Kessler without even looking, escorted off the aircraft. Diana's knees nearly gave out. "Wait, please," she blurted out, panic cracking her voice. "Ms. Caldwell, it was just a misunderstanding." Avery turned her head slightly, her eyes piercing. "That's what you called it earlier, isn't it?" Diana opened her mouth, then closed it again. There were no words that could fix this. Not anymore. Avery studied her in silence. And that silence? It was worse than yelling. It dragged on long enough to make Diana squirm in place, her confidence draining away in front of a full cabin of watching eyes. Finally, Avery leaned back slightly, her voice as soft as it was dangerous. "Tell me," she said, "deliberate and quiet, why exactly did you think I wasn't supposed to be in this seat?" Every passenger was watching now. There was no pretending, no shifting eyes, just stillness. Leah Monroe, still standing frozen near the galley, clutched the silver tray she'd been carrying earlier. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a deep unease. Grayson Blake, seated across the aisle, leaned forward slightly, his interest sharpened. A slow grin tugged at the corner of his mouth. He'd been waiting for this. A few rows ahead, Jenna Holloway sat with her arms crossed, her jaw tight. She didn't say a word, but the look on her face was pure vindication. Diana's cheeks flushed red. She began, but the words stalled halfway out. There was no excuse she could offer now that wouldn't sound weak, cowardly. Avery didn't need to respond. Her silence was its own sentence, and Diana knew she had already lost. Her breath came faster, her chest tightening under the weight of Avery's steady gaze. She had always been the one with the power, the one who called the shots, the one who maintained order at 30,000 feet. But now? That control had slipped through her fingers the moment she reached out and grabbed the wrong passenger. And the entire plane had seen it. Passengers' faces reflected a mix of disbelief, discomfort, and quiet satisfaction. Some had likely suspected the reason why Diana had chosen to target Avery. Now, they were simply waiting for her to say it out loud. Avery leaned back, relaxed, dangerously so. The corner of her lips curled just a bit, not quite a smile. Something colder. "I'm waiting," she said. Diana swallowed hard. Her throat was painfully dry. If she admitted the truth, she would destroy herself. But to lie, that would be just as fatal now. Leah shifted beside her, visibly uncomfortable. She'd worked with Diana long enough to recognize the pattern. This wasn't the first time her senior had made a passenger feel unwelcome. Not blatantly, not aggressively, but with that subtle undercurrent of superiority that was easy to deny and impossible to prove, except this time there was no denying it, not when everyone had seen it. I was just following standard procedures, Diana said finally, trying to level her voice. It had nothing to do with... Avery arched a single brow, challenging her to finish that sentence. Diana stopped. The cabin had grown deadly quiet. A few phones were out now, not held high, but angled just enough to suggest people were recording. Avery let the moment stretch until Diana looked like she wanted to vanish into the floor. "You asked for my ticket," Avery said slowly, tapping the armrest with her manicured fingers. "Fine. Maybe you were just being thorough." Diana exhaled in shaky relief, sensing a possible way out. But Avery wasn't done. "You didn't ask his," she continued, nodding toward Grayson Blake. Grayson, amused, raised his champagne glass with a slight smirk, confirming it. "Nope." She didn't. Avery's eyes moved to the woman a few rows ahead. Or hers. Jenna shook her head. Not even a glance. Avery returned her gaze to Diana. "Just me." Diana's skin burned. She could feel the heat radiating through her cheeks down her neck. Leah stood still beside her, lips pressed together. Her discomfort was obvious. Avery's tone didn't rise. She didn't need it to. "So," she said lightly, her words slicing the air like a scalpel, "what exactly made me the only passenger worth questioning?" Diana had no answer, none that wouldn't indict her further. She stood still, eyes locked on Avery, trying desperately to find words that didn't exist. Her fingers curled into the seams of her uniform. And then, Avery did something subtle, but devastating. She smirked, just barely. She knew Diana had no defense. And so did everyone else. Passengers whispered, eyes wide. Phones remained in hands, their cameras subtly angled toward the confrontation. Even the hum of the aircraft felt louder now, like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Then Avery leaned forward, eyes narrowing just slightly. "Tell me, Ms. Kessler," she said, using Diana's full name for the first time, making it sound like a death sentence. "What do you think happens when a flight attendant lays hands on the owner of an airline?" The chill that swept over Diana was instant. She already knew the answer. Her breath quickened, shallow and sharp. She could feel her pulse pounding in her ears. The cabin was no longer just curious. It was waiting. Leah's voice broke the silence, quiet but urgent. "Diana," she said, barely above a whisper. "You need to step away." Diana's hands twitched. Step away. Was that it? 15 years of flawless service, and now she was the problem? She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to hold on to what dignity she had left. "Ms. Caldwell," she said shakily, I regret if my actions caused any misunderstanding. I was only trying to—" "To what?" Avery interrupted, her voice cool and unreadable. Diana swallowed. Hard, Avery tilted her head, letting the weight of silence fall on Diana like a collapsing wall. She was drowning in it. From across the aisle, Grayson Blake let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. He shook his head slowly and muttered just loud enough for Diana Kessler to hear. "Give it up." A few rows ahead, Jenna Holloway scoffed under her breath. "She's really scrambling now." Diana's jaw clenched, her hands balled into tight fists. Her voice wavered as she faced Avery Caldwell, still seated, composed, and untouchable. "Ms. Caldwell, You grabbed my arm," Avery interrupted, her tone sharp but controlled. The words weren't loud. They weren't even angry. But they were final. Diana froze. Her breath caught in her throat. The passengers didn't need it shouted. They'd seen it, heard it, and now they were watching her downfall unfold in real time. Phones were still raised subtly. Some passengers pretended to scroll, but the angles of their screens betrayed the truth. Everything was being recorded. Avery turned slightly in her seat, her gaze now directed toward Leah Monroe. "Leah, do you know your company's protocol for when a crew member touches a passenger unnecessarily?" Leah hesitated. Her throat moved as she swallowed. Then she nodded once, voice barely above a whisper. "It's immediate termination." The words landed like a gavel striking the bench. Diana's heart stopped. She could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Avery exhaled lightly and turned back to face her, the faint trace of her earlier smirk now gone. "So tell me, Ms. Kessler," she said, her voice colder now, more exacting. "Should I follow airline policy? Or would you prefer—" "I make an exception." Panic surged like a tidal wave through Diana's chest. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. She opened her mouth, her voice trembling. "Please, Miss Caldwell," she said, the words cracking for the first time since the beginning of this confrontation. The wall of professionalism she'd built around herself for years was crumbling. I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake. A terrible one." Avery didn't respond right away. She let the silence do its work. Let Diana sit in the weight of her own actions. Then slowly, Avery leaned forward. Just a little. Enough to make the space between them feel smaller. Heavier. I know. Those two words were a sentence, a verdict, and a declaration of truth. Because this wasn't forgiveness. This was a reckoning. And Diana Kessler knew in that moment. This was only the beginning of the consequences. Her tailored uniform felt tight now, suffocating. The once crisp collar pressed hard against her neck. Beads of sweat lined her forehead. Around her, passengers whispered. Some looked at her with open judgment. Others, with quiet delight. She had lost control of the cabin. No, of her entire narrative. And the worst part? Avery Caldwell had never raised her voice. Never asked for a scene. Never demanded an apology. She didn't need to. Because power doesn't have to announce itself. It just has to exist. Leah shifted beside her again, her voice more assertive this time. "Diana," she said, firm. "You need to step away. Now." Diana didn't move. She couldn't. Her body felt frozen, rooted to the spot by fear and shame. But then, the intercom crackled overhead. The calm voice of Captain Ellis Ford echoed through the cabin. Diana Kessler, please report to the cockpit. The cabin went still. It was the kind of stillness that doesn't feel like quiet, but rather judgment. Grayson leaned back and shook his head again, muttering, "Yeah, that's not good." Jenna smirked from her seat. "She's done." Diana's palms were damp, her throat dry. She could feel the collective gaze of the entire first-class cabin pressed down on her, heavier than her own guilt. There was no recovering now, no clever explanation, no policy to hide behind. And Avery? She looked down at her perfectly manicured nails and spoke without even glancing at Diana. "I believe they're waiting for you." The words were quiet, but they hit like thunder. Diana's breath caught again. Her fingers twitched. She turned, slowly, toward the front of the cabin. The walk toward the cockpit felt like a funeral procession, each step dragged with unbearable weight. No one looked away now. Some passengers wore pity, others barely veiled amusement, and some were recording the whole thing. Behind her, Leah whispered, "You really should have just checked her ticket and moved on. That cut deeper than anything." Diana's hand shook as she reached the cockpit door. She paused, took one final breath, then pressed the intercom button. This is Diana," she said, barely above a whisper, "reporting to the cockpit." The door clicked open, and she stepped inside. The door shut behind her with a quiet but decisive thud. No more passengers, no more whispers, no phones, just silence. But it wasn't peaceful. It was crushing. The cockpit was dim, bathed in a cold blue light from the instrument panel. It felt like a different world. Captain Ford didn't look up right away. His expression was unreadable as he adjusted a few dials, then turned slowly toward her. He'd been flying long enough to know what a call from corporate mid-flight meant. It meant someone's career was about to crash and burn. Beside him, First Officer Logan Reyes kept his focus on the controls, but his tight jaw betrayed the tension he was trying to hide. The flight phone still hummed softly in the background. Someone important was still on the line. Diana didn't need to ask who. Captain Ford let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple before fixing his eyes on her. "You really stepped in it this time, Kessler?" Her mouth went dry. "Captain, He raised a hand, silencing her. "Sit." She hesitated, then lowered herself onto the small fold-down seat near the door. "Do you know who you just laid hands on?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. Diana looked down. "I didn't know. Not good enough." His voice hardened. Diana flinched. Captain Ford leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You know how many passengers complain about how they're treated?" he asked. She didn't answer. "Too many," he said, "and most of them don't have the power to do anything about it." He paused, eyes narrowing. "But this time, you pick the one person who does." Diana's hands trembled in her lap. The captain's voice dropped a register, lower, graver. "You didn't just embarrass a customer. You humiliated the owner of the airline." He leaned back, the seat creaking under his weight. "You questioned her, challenged her, touched her." And in that small, quiet room, Diana Kessler understood, for the first time, that her life was no longer hers to control. "You did all of it," Captain Ford said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of judgment in front of an entire plane full of witnesses. Diana Kessler felt the nausea twist deeper in her gut. I was just following protocol," she tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," the captain snapped, sharper this time. "You weren't enforcing policy. You were enforcing bias. And now, you're going to answer for it." The cockpit radio crackled to life, interrupting the tension. A steady, firm voice came through the static. "This is Malcolm Pierce, Senior Operations Manager. I've been briefed on the situation. Captain Ford, can you confirm if the crew member involved is currently in the cockpit?" Captain Ford lifted the handset, holding Diana's gaze as he spoke. She's here." There was a pause. Then came the reply, colder than before. "Diana Kessler, you are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately." The words didn't echo. They imploded, right in the center of Diana's chest. She stopped breathing. Captain Ford watched her carefully as the gravity of the moment hit her like a free fall. Relieved of duty, mid-flight. It was almost unheard of. Malcolm's voice continued, unwavering. "Upon landing, you will be escorted from the aircraft and placed on administrative leave pending a formal review with Orion Sky's executive board." Her vision blurred. Her hands dug into the fabric of her skirt as she tried to anchor herself. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking beneath the pressure. This is my life. I didn't mean to." "Irrelevant," Malcolm cut in without missing a beat. "You'll receive formal documentation via email within the hour, outlining next steps. Until then, I recommend you remain professional and avoid further disruption." Silence. Then came the final blow. "We land in 30 minutes. I suggest you begin preparing for the consequences." The line went dead. Diana sat motionless. Her chest tightened until she could barely breathe. 15 years in the sky. Vanished in under 15 minutes. Captain Ford exhaled, slow and steady. He shook his head, not with anger, but with the quiet disappointment that hits harder. "I suggest you take a seat in the back, Kessler," he said. "You're a passenger now." Her body felt like stone. She didn't speak, didn't argue, just stood up slowly, her entire world crumbling beneath her feet. Back in first class, Avery Caldwell took a delicate sip of her drink, letting the coolness of it wash across her tongue. She leaned back, serene. The wheels hadn't even touched the ground yet, and she was far from finished. The walk back to the rear cabin was excruciating. Every step Diana took was laced with shame. She wanted to run, to vanish, to evaporate before the whispers grew louder. But it was already too late. She stepped back into the first-class aisle. The silence was deafening. All eyes turned to her, no longer with respect, but with disdain, disbelief, even satisfaction. The passengers she once commanded now watched her with thinly veiled judgment. But the worst blow? Avery didn't even look at her. She wasn't worth the attention. That cold shoulder? It said more than any insult ever could. Diana's breath came in shallow gasps, her legs stiff, her throat dry. She moved past the seats she had once ruled over with sharp precision. Leah Monroe stood near the galley, arms crossed, saying nothing. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes that twisted Diana's stomach. Pity maybe, or was it quiet satisfaction? Diana couldn't tell. She didn't want to. Finally, she reached the back of the aircraft. Everything felt smaller back here. Cramped, dimmer, colder. She spotted an empty seat near the rear exit, the kind she used to assign to passengers she believed didn't belong in first class. Now it was hers. She sank into it wordlessly. Eyes forward, hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned bone white. Her career, her name, her place in the sky was falling apart around her, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Up front, Avery exhaled slowly, crossing her legs. A few rows ahead, Jenna Holloway leaned sideways in her seat. "Not even going to look at her?" she asked. Avery gave the faintest smirk. "She's not my problem anymore." Grayson Blake let out a low, amused breath. "Cold," he said, raising an eyebrow. Avery picked up her phone and scrolled calmly through her messages, not even sparing a glance toward the rear of the plane. Just business. And with that, Diana Kessler ceased to exist. Not because Avery had ruined her, because Diana had done it to herself. The plane cruised steadily, engines humming in the background. But for Diana, it felt like she was free-falling. She sat stiffly, staring blankly ahead, her knees drawn in, her hands gripping them like anchors. Everything felt distant, muffled, like she was underwater. 15 years she had spent walking those aisles, commanding presence, issuing orders. She dictated how things ran, who belonged where, and who didn't. And now? She was just another passenger. No. It was worse than that. Passengers still had dignity. They still had places to go, lives to return to. Diana had no idea what would be waiting for her when the plane touched down. Her mind swirled with the aftermath, the formal review, the meeting with the board, the finality of it all. There would be no comeback story, no quiet reassignment, no second chance. She could already imagine the press release. Orient Skies takes matters of passenger treatment seriously and has relieved the crew member involved of all duties effective immediately. She could already picture the headline: Flight attendant removed mid-flight after confrontation with airline owner. Her stomach churned violently. This wasn't a suspension. This was career suicide. And the cruelest part? She had done this to herself. That quiet voice in the back of her mind, the one she'd silenced for years, whispered the truth she didn't want to hear. You saw her. You didn't think she belonged. You didn't check anyone else's ticket, just hers. And when she didn't comply, you grabbed her. You pushed harder. Because deep down, you didn't believe she had the right to sit in that seat. Diana squeezed her eyes shut, forcing back the burn in her throat. The voice in her head was right. There had been no policy violation, no misconduct from Avery, just a calm woman in a first-class seat, and it had unraveled her. Diana Kessler stared blankly at the seat ahead, her body stiff with shame. Her stomach churned with a slow, relentless nausea. This isn't fair, she thought, but even she didn't believe that anymore. Because wasn't it? She didn't have to turn around to know Avery Caldwell was still seated in first class. Unbothered, composed, a woman who had barely raised her voice, barely moved, and yet had changed Diana's life with just a few words. She hadn't demanded anything outrageous. She hadn't shouted or caused a scene. She hadn't needed to. Because true power doesn't have to make noise. It just waits for the right moment. Diana flinched slightly when she sensed movement beside her. A younger flight attendant crouched quietly at her side. It was Angela, one of the newer hires. "Diana," she said softly. Diana turned her head slowly, hating how gentle the voice was, how careful. It was the tone people used when speaking to someone whose fall was already complete. Angela hesitated, her voice uncertain. "I just wanted to check if you're okay." Diana stiffened. No one had ever asked her that. Not like this. Not with genuine concern. She'd spent years commanding these aisles, rarely returning kindness. And now, here it was, and she didn't know how to receive it. "I'm fine," she said too quickly, too sharp. The crack in her voice betrayed the lie instantly. Angela paused, nodded slightly, and rose to her feet. "We land in 15 minutes, she said, then walked away, blending back into the flow of final cabin checks. 15 minutes. Diana had already been counting down. 15 minutes until she stepped off this plane, not as a leader, not as a respected crew member, but as the cautionary tale passengers would whisper about in terminals. And Avery would be there when it happened. She barely heard the captain's announcement overhead. His calm, practiced voice guided passengers through their descent preparations. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are upright." Diana didn't move, didn't glance around, didn't reach for anything. She kept her eyes locked on the safety card in the pocket in front of her. Her hands were cold, her chest tight. She had never felt this way before a landing, but then again, she had never landed with her entire career already buried. Angela passed by again, checking on passengers. This time she said nothing to Diana, just a quick, unreadable glance. Up front, Avery reclined slightly, swirling the last of her sparkling water. She was serene. She had been since the start. Jenna Holloway leaned across the aisle, unable to hide her smirk. "So what happens when we land?" she asked. Avery didn't look away from her phone. "She'll be escorted off." Grayson Blake chuckled from his seat. "That's it." Avery finally glanced up, her tone almost amused. "You wanted more?" Grayson shrugged. "You're the owner? You could have had her fired on the spot." Avery smiled faintly. "She fired herself the moment she laid hands on me." Jenna snorted. "She doesn't even realize how deep she's in." Avery's eyes flicked toward the window as the plane tilted, beginning its descent. "Oh," she murmured, locking her screen. "She will." Back in the rear of the plane, Diana fought to keep her breath steady. She didn't need to look to feel it. The eyes, the unspoken tension, the shift in atmosphere. Some passengers pretended not to watch. Others didn't bother pretending at all. She had once been the person people respected, feared, obeyed. Now she was the example. The one who had let prejudice define policy. The one who had pushed too far. And now, there was no policy left to hide behind. She had tried to justify it at first, but the truth was clear. There was no justification. Avery Caldwell hadn't been rude, hadn't disobeyed any rules, hadn't raised suspicion. She just didn't fit Diana's idea of who was supposed to sit in first class. And when she didn't apologize for existing in that space, Diana doubled down. That decision, born of bias and pride, had ended everything. The plane shuddered slightly as the wheels met the tarmac. A soft smattering of applause came from a few passengers, but it didn't feel like celebration. It felt like the curtain call of a very public downfall. Diana could feel it. Every breath, every glance, every quiet word whispered between seats. Up front, Avery sat back, rolling her shoulders gently, stretching her fingers. She didn't need to speak. The moment had arrived. The show was over. Now came the consequences. The plane slowed to a halt. The intercom crackled one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. The local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off." Ding. The sign clicked off. The cabin instantly filled with movement, people unbuckling, standing, collecting their belongings. But Diana didn't move. She couldn't. She already knew who was waiting at the front of the plane. 2 uniformed security officers, stationed just outside the jet bridge. Quiet, professional, and Avery Caldwell standing now, adjusting the sleeve of her blazer like she had all the time in the world. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't afraid. She had already won. Diana sat frozen, her heart pounding like it was trying to escape her chest. Her fingers curled into her lap, trembling. She didn't need to guess what came next. The whispers that had haunted her all flight had grown into something else now. Expectation. Passengers were no longer just watching. They were waiting to see the fall. Avery moved down the aisle with the kind of grace that didn't come from effort, but from certainty. Each step was confident. Calm. She paused for only a moment near the front, glancing back slightly. Her expression didn't change. She wasn't angry. She didn't need to be. Avery Caldwell moved with unshaken elegance, her steps unhurried as she made her way to the front of the aircraft. Her expression remained calm, her posture upright, and her presence unmistakably composed. She didn't need to raise her voice to own the moment. She had won this long before takeoff. Behind her, Diana Kessler sat hollowed out by shame. Whatever control she had clung to had long since slipped from her fingers. And now, the reality of her defeat was being paraded through the plane. Jenna Holloway leaned slightly toward Avery, her voice low, but loud enough to carry to Diana's seat near the back. "Bet she's regretting that little power trip now." Across the aisle, Grayson Blake smirked and sipped what remained of his champagne. "She hasn't even hit the worst part yet." Diana's jaw clenched. She refused to look at them. refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. At the front of the plane, Leah Monroe emerged from the galley, avoiding Diana.